Dorothy Dandridge. March 30th, 1955. The Academy Awards. Dorothy Dandridge sits among Hollywood's elite, draped in an ivory gown, waiting. Her nomination for Carmen Jones made history. She was the first black woman ever up for Best Actress. But while the industry applauded, it hesitated. Leading roles opposite white actors, rarely offered. Hotels, some still refused her a room, even when she was the star attraction. At the prestigious Macambo nightclub, she could perform, but had to enter through the back. Still, she refused to be sidelined. She turned down roles that demeaned black women, demanding respect in an industry that didn't hand it out easily. Without her, the road for black leading ladies would have been even steeper. Halle Berry, who portrayed Dandridge in Introducing Dorothy Dandridge, called her a guiding light. But Hollywood's neglect took its toll. Financial struggles, failed relationships, and relentless barriers weighed on her. In 1965, at just 42, she passed away due to a substance-related incident involving blood pressure medication. Some whisper about foul play, but no evidence ever surfaced. What's undeniable? Her legacy. She didn't just break barriers, she shattered them, proving black women belonged in the spotlight, not just the background. Sidney Poitier. April 13th, 1964. The Academy Awards. Anne Bancroft tears open the envelope. A pause. Then history. Sidney Poitier and Lilies of the Field! The crowd erupts.
The winner is Sidney Poitier and Lilies.
Poitier walks to the stage, overwhelmed. It has been a long journey to this moment, he says, his voice thick with emotion. And it had been.
It is a long journey to this moment.
Born in Miami in 1927 but raised in the Bahamas, Poitier arrived in New York with just a few dollars. Some sources say 3, others 5. He washed dishes, slept in bus stations, and struggled to find acting work. His first audition at the American Negro Theater? A disaster. His thick Bahamian accent nearly cost him everything, but Poitier was relentless. He listened to the radio broadcasts, mimicked American speech patterns, and trained tirelessly. Months later, he earned a role in the theater's production of Days of Our Youth, setting him on a path that would redefine Hollywood. His film debut came in 1950 with No Way Out, where he played a black doctor treating a racist white patient, a role that immediately marked him as a trailblazer. Poitier refused to play demeaning characters, famously rejecting roles that leaned into harmful stereotypes. He even turned down Porgy and Bess, because he felt it reinforced negative portrayals of black life, only relenting under immense pressure. By the 1960s, he was a leading man, shattering barriers in films like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, where he portrayed a black doctor engaged to a white woman at a time when interracial marriage was still illegal in parts of America. The film divided audiences. Some called it revolutionary, others found it too sanitized. But one thing was clear, Poitier had changed Hollywood, and he wasn't done. In the 70s, he stepped behind the camera, directing films like Buck and The Preacher, creating more opportunities for black talent. His influence stretched far beyond the screen. In 2009, President Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, calling him a man who not only entertained, but enlightened. When he passed in 2022, tributes poured in from generations of actors he inspired. Denzel Washington once said, "I wanted to be like Sidney Poitier." And because of Poitier, he and so many others could be. Hattie McDaniel. Imagine making Hollywood history, only to be shut out of your own success. That was Hattie McDaniel's reality in 1939. She became the first black actress to win an Academy Award for her role as Mammy in Gone with the Wind, but when the film premiered in Atlanta, racial policies kept her from attending. Some say it was strictly segregation laws, while others believe the studio itself made the call. Either way, McDaniel was forced to celebrate from afar. Even on Oscar night, she was seated at a segregated table in the back of the room, away from her white co-stars, but she refused to let racism define her career. "I sincerely hope I shall always be a credit to my race and to the motion picture industry," she once said. And she lived by it. Critics, including civil rights leaders, often called out her repeated roles as maids and domestic workers, but McDaniel defended her choices, arguing that working within the system was the only way to change it. Off-screen, she made real change happen. In 1945, she won a landmark legal battle against racist housing laws in Los Angeles, securing her right to live in a previously all-white neighborhood. She also became the first black woman to star in a radio show, The Beulah Show, breaking barriers beyond the big screen. McDaniel's Oscar win was both a triumph and a stark reminder of Hollywood's racial divide. But she cracked the door open for future generations, proving that talent couldn't be ignored forever. Paul Robeson. It's 1936 and Paul Robeson steps onto the screen in Showboat, his deep, resonant voice filling the theater with Ol' Man River. But this wasn't just a performance, it was a declaration. At a time when black actors were often trapped in demeaning caricatures, Robeson refused to play subservient roles. Instead, he sought out characters with depth, like his groundbreaking portrayal of Othello on Broadway in 1943, the first major U.S. production to cast a black actor in the title role. His presence on that stage shattered barriers, proving that Shakespeare's greatest tragedy belonged to him just as much as it did to the world. But Robeson's influence stretched far beyond the stage and screen. A scholar, an athlete, a lawyer, and a polyglot fluent in over 20 languages, he wielded his fame like a weapon against injustice. He spoke out against racism, colonialism, and oppression even when it cost him everything. In 1950, the US government revoked his passport, silencing his voice on the world stage. Yet even in exile, his influence never faded. His words, his music, his defiance, they rippled through generations, inspiring artists, activists, and revolutionaries alike. Some even speculate that his refusal to back down made him a target of government surveillance, though official records remain murky. What's undeniable is that Robeson didn't just perform, he transformed the very fabric of Hollywood and beyond. Lena Horne. Lena Horne wasn't just a star, she was a revolution. In 1942, she signed a historic long-term contract with MGM, breaking barriers as one of the first black women to do so. But Hollywood had its limits. Studios wanted her beauty, her voice, her presence, but only on their terms. They expected black actresses to play maids or comic relief. Horne refused. She rejected roles that fed into racist stereotypes, even when it meant fewer opportunities. Instead, MGM often cast her in musical numbers that could be easily cut for Southern audiences. But even within those restrictions, she made history. Her performance of Stormy Weather in 1943 wasn't just a song. It was defiance wrapped in melody. The way she delivered it, full of longing and resilience, turned it into an anthem. It became her signature, proving she was more than just a pretty face. She was a powerhouse performer. Off camera, she was just as fearless. During World War II, she refused to perform for segregated audiences, famously walking off stage when she saw black soldiers seated behind German prisoners of war. She worked with the NAACP, fought against racism in Hollywood, and marched alongside Martin Luther King Jr. during the 1963 March on Washington. But activism came at a price. During the Red Scare of the 1950s, her leftist associations led to blacklisting, nearly ending her career. Still, she never backed down. While her Broadway comeback with Lena Horne, The Lady and Her Music in 1981 happened after her peak years, it cemented her as a legend, earning her a Tony Award and 2 Grammys. Because of her, future generations of black performers had a path forward. She didn't just break barriers, she shattered them. Ethel Waters. It's 1939, and Ethel Waters steps onto the Broadway stage in Mamba's Daughters. The audience is electrified. Some accounts say the applause seemed endless, though the exact number of curtain calls is lost to time. What's certain? That night, Waters wasn't just performing. She was breaking barriers, a black woman commanding a major Broadway production with undeniable presence. Her ambition didn't stop there. Already a celebrated blues and jazz singer, she became the first black woman to star in her own television special, The Ethel Waters Show, in 1939, an era when television itself was still in its infancy. A full decade before Nat King Cole's variety show, Waters was pioneering representation on a medium that barely existed yet. Then came Pinky in 1949. Waters took on the role of Granny, a proud, resilient matriarch in a film that tackled racial identity and prejudice head-on. Her performance was so powerful, so layered, that she became only the second black actress ever nominated for an Academy Award, following Hattie McDaniel's win for Gone with the Wind in 1940. But while McDaniel's role fit Hollywood's expected mold of a devoted maid, Waters' Granny was different. A woman with dignity, agency, and an unshakable love for her granddaughter. A role that defied expectations, and audiences felt it. Yet, despite her success, Hollywood remained hesitant to give black women leading dramatic roles. By the late 1940s, Waters saw opportunities dwindle. In 1948, she worked only a few weeks, despite once being among the highest-paid black performers of the 1930s. The industry's message was clear: no matter the talent, there were limits. But Waters she never accepted limits. Her voice, whether in song, on stage, or on screen, was always bigger than the barriers placed around her. And while Hollywood may not have fully embraced her, history did. A U.S. postage stamp in 1994, a Hollywood Walk of Fame star in the early 2000s, and her legacy, still shaping the future of black performers who refuse to be confined to just one stage. Canada Lee. Hollywood in the 1940s had a rigid playbook for black actors. Maids, butlers, comic relief. Canada Lee tore that script apart. In Lifeboat from 1944, he played Joe, a shipwrecked sailor, strong, intelligent, and dignified. No broken English, no shuffling gait, just a man as complex as any other. Alfred Hitchcock fought to keep Lee in the role, rejecting studio pressure to make Joe more submissive. Lee refused to play it any other way. "I will only take roles that educate society about race and enhance the image of African Americans," he declared. And he meant it. Off-screen, he was just as fearless. He spoke out against segregation, raised money for civil rights groups, and refused to perform for segregated audiences. That made him enemies in high places. By the early 1950s, the House Un-American Activities Committee accused him of communist ties. Studios blacklisted him. Roles vanished overnight. He went from being one of the most respected black actors in America to struggling to find work. Still, he never backed down. In 1951, he traveled to South Africa to star in Cry, The Beloved Country, a film about apartheid. His health was already failing, and during filming, he collapsed. Some say from exhaustion, others believe it was the culmination of years of stress and financial hardship. A year later, at just 45, he was gone. Uremic poisoning, worsened by malnutrition. He died broke, blacklisted, and largely forgotten by Hollywood. But his legacy? That never faded. Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte, they followed the path Lee carved, demanding dignity in their roles. Today, his name may not be as well known, but his impact, it's everywhere. Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis. It's 1961. Ruby Dee steps onto the screen in A Raisin in the Sun, embodying Ruth Younger with a quiet strength that made Hollywood take notice. Lorraine Hansberry's groundbreaking play had already shaken Broadway, but now, the film brought its raw truth to an even wider audience. It wasn't just a story. It was a mirror reflecting the struggles of black families, battling redlining, economic oppression, and the weight of deferred dreams. Dee's performance wasn't just acting, it was lived experience poured onto the screen, making her one of the most respected actresses of her time. Meanwhile, Ossie Davis was building his own legacy, not just as an actor, but as a writer and director determined to reshape black representation in Hollywood. In 1970, he co-directed Cotton Comes to Harlem with Melvin Van Peebles, a film that shattered stereotypes by giving audiences complex, dynamic black protagonists, a relatively rare sight in mainstream Hollywood at the time. Davis wasn't interested in playing into Hollywood's old formulas. He wanted black characters who were sharp, strong, and fully realized, and he delivered. But their impact didn't stop at the screen. Dee and Davis were warriors for justice. They marched in the 1963 March on Washington, stood alongside Martin Luther King Jr., and refused to let Hollywood dictate how black stories should be told. Ossie Davis even delivered the eulogy at Malcolm X's funeral in 1965, cementing his role as both an artist and an activist. They weren't just performers, they were revolutionaries, using their voices to break barriers and inspire future generations. And that legacy, it still echoes today, shaping the storytellers who refuse to stay silent. Herb Jeffries. Hollywood in the 1930s was a world where black cowboys were practically invisible on screen, but then came Herb Jeffries, towering in the saddle, guitar in hand, rewriting the rules of the Western. Starring in Harlem on the Prairie in 1937, he became a rare sight, a black cowboy hero in a genre that had long ignored the real history of black frontiersmen. Studios hesitated, claiming he wasn't black enough for the role. So, in a move that still sparks debate, Jeffries darkened his skin to fit Hollywood's narrow racial expectations. He didn't stop with one film. The Bronze Buckaroo and Harlem Rides the Range followed in 1939, proving black audiences deserve their own legends. But Jeffries was more than a cowboy. His smooth vocals landed him alongside Duke Ellington, recording hits like Flamingo. He could have passed as white for an easier career, but he refused, famously saying, "If I had chosen to live my life passing as white, I'd have never been able to sing with Duke Ellington." His legacy? breaking barriers so future black actors could ride into Hollywood with fewer roadblocks. While Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte carved their own paths, Jeffries' stand against racial erasure in film set a precedent. He wasn't just a cowboy, he was a pioneer. Juanita Moore. Hollywood in the 1950s wasn't kind to black actresses. If they landed a role, it was usually as a nameless maid or a background character. But Juanita Moore wasn't about to be sidelined. In 1959, she shattered expectations with Imitation of Life, delivering a performance so raw and heartbreaking that audiences wept in theaters. As Annie Johnson, a devoted mother whose light-skinned daughter denies her black heritage, Moore brought a depth rarely afforded to black women on screen. The Academy took notice, making her only the 5th black actor ever nominated for an Oscar. But Hollywood's doors didn't swing open overnight. Substantial roles for black actresses remained scarce, even after Moore's groundbreaking performance. Rather than wait for change, she became an advocate, working with the Negro Actors Guild to fight for fair treatment. She also dedicated herself to the Ebony Showcase Theater, a pioneering black-owned institution that gave rising black performers a stage when Hollywood wouldn't. Even decades later, her influence lingers. In 2024, 10 years after her passing, she was posthumously honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, proof that her legacy refused to be forgotten. Juanita Moore wasn't just an actress, she was a force of nature. Woody Strode. Los Angeles, 1946. The Rams break the NFL's unofficial color barrier by signing Woody Strode and Kenny Washington. But inside the locker room, tension crackled. Some white teammates threatened to strike. Opponents took cheap shots. Strode later described it as a battle, one he was more than ready for. But football was just the first act. Hollywood came knocking, though not with open arms. Black actors in the 1950s were often sidelined to comic relief or background roles. Strode refused to be either. He started with small appearances, including The Ten Commandments in 1956, but his breakthrough came in Spartacus, 1960. That brutal, unflinching duel against Kirk Douglas, it wasn't just a fight, it was a statement. A black man, not as a servant, but as a warrior. Audiences took notice. That same year he starred in Sergeant Rutledge, playing a Buffalo soldier falsely accused of a crime. Under the direction of John Ford, Strode wasn't a sidekick, he was the hero. It was a role that challenged Hollywood's expectations. He once said, "I was never going to play a butler, I had to be a man." And he meant it. His friendship with Ford led to more roles, proving that a black actor could carry a film with dignity and strength. Hollywood may not have fully embraced him, but his impact was undeniable. Without Strode, the path for actors like Denzel Washington in Glory or Chadwick Boseman in Black Panther would have been far steeper. He didn't just open doors, he kicked them wide open. Butterfly McQueen. Hollywood knew her as Prissy, the high-pitched, wide-eyed maid from Gone with the Wind. But Butterfly McQueen, she knew herself as something much more. "I didn't mind playing a maid the first time," she once said, "but after I did the same thing over and over, I resented it." And she wasn't afraid to say it out loud. In an era when black actresses were expected to smile through typecasting, McQueen refused to be boxed in. She spoke out against Hollywood's narrow roles for black women, even when it cost her work. After Gone with the Wind, she found herself trapped in a cycle of servile, comedic roles. Maids, nannies, characters with little depth or dignity. Frustrated, she stepped away from Hollywood in the 1940s. But she wasn't done making history. She turned to theater, appearing in productions like The World's My Oyster, and even took on television roles, including a stint on the sitcom Beulah in the 1950s. McQueen also pursued education, earning a political science degree from City College of New York at 64, proving reinvention has no age limit. And she wasn't just bold in her career choices. She was an outspoken atheist, a rarity for any public figure at the time, let alone a black woman in mid-century America. "As my ancestors are free from slavery, I am free from the slavery of religion," she declared in 1989. Her refusal to conform wasn't just about Hollywood. It was about self-definition in a world that tried to define her. Every black actress who dared to demand more, every performer who refused to be typecast, owes a debt to Butterfly McQueen. Her legacy isn't just in the roles she played, but in the ones she refused to accept. James Edwards. In 1949, James Edwards shattered expectations in Home of the Brave, delivering a performance that wasn't just powerful, it was revolutionary. As Private Peter Moss, a black soldier grappling with racism in the military, Edwards brought raw emotion to the screen, forcing audiences to confront prejudice head-on. Hollywood took notice, but change came slowly. Despite proving he could lead a serious drama, the roles that followed were sporadic. He refused to play the stereotypical servant or comic relief, insisting on characters with dignity and depth, a stance that cost him jobs but cemented his legacy. In The Steel Helmet 2 years later, he played a hardened medic in a gritty Korean War film, adding layers to a role that could have been forgettable. Then came The Killing in 1956, Stanley Kubrick's tense crime thriller, where Edwards played a sharp-witted track attendant, once again proving that black characters could be more than background figures. But Hollywood's doors remained only half open. He was blacklisted during the Red Scare for refusing to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, a decision that derailed his career. Studios backed away and leading roles slipped through his fingers. Still, Edwards never stopped fighting. He turned to writing, freelancing for studios, and even penning books to keep his career alive. In 1970, he made his final film appearance in Patton, playing the general's valet. A small role, but a poignant one. Edwards had spent his career breaking barriers, proving that black actors deserve respect. A decade after his passing, he was posthumously inducted into the Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame, a recognition that came too late but was undeniably deserved. Louise Beavers. In 1934, Louise Beavers delivered a performance that defied expectations. Imitation of Life wasn't just another Hollywood melodrama. It was one of the first mainstream films to tackle racial identity and the sacrifices of motherhood. Beavers played Delilah, a devoted housekeeper whose light-skinned daughter chooses to pass as white, rejecting her heritage. The emotional weight of the role was immense, and Beavers infused it with a depth rarely afforded to black actresses at the time. Critics praised her heartbreaking performance, yet the Academy overlooked it, an omission many saw as a blatant example of Hollywood's racial bias. Beavers' career was a paradox. She was a trailblazer, yet Hollywood confined her to maid roles, expecting her to maintain a heavier weight and adopt a Southern accent, neither of which were natural to her. While she sometimes used a Southern drawl in films like She'd Done Him Wrong, it was more a necessity than a choice. But Beavers refused to let these limitations define her. She transformed even the most typecast characters into fully realized human beings, infusing them with warmth, dignity, and quiet strength. Off-screen, she was just as fearless. In the 1940s, she became a key figure in the fight against racial housing covenants in Los Angeles' Sugar Hill neighborhood, a battleground for black home ownership rights. Her activism helped challenge discriminatory real estate laws that sought to keep black families from moving into affluent areas. And her legacy didn't stop there. Decades later, in 1976, she was posthumously inducted into the Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame, ensuring her name would be remembered as a pioneer who paved the way for future generations of black actresses to demand more substantial roles. Clarence Muse. Hollywood in the late 1920s wasn't exactly welcoming black actors with open arms. But Clarence Muse, he didn't wait for permission. In 1929, he starred in Hearts and Dixie, the first all-black talkie, a groundbreaking moment in cinema history. While some say he was the first black actor with a speaking role, others note that Lincoln Perry, known as Stephen Fetchit, also spoke in the film. Either way, Muse's presence signaled a shift. But he wasn't just an actor. He was a writer, composer, and director, determined to carve out meaningful spaces for black artists. In 1939, he co-wrote Way Down South with Langston Hughes, fighting for an authentic black narrative, only for the studio to dilute it, prioritizing box office appeal over truth. That battle for dignity defined his career. Over 150 films later, Muse had built a legacy that future icons like Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte would stand on. And when Broadway needed a shakeup, he delivered, becoming the first African-American to direct a Broadway play with Run Little Chillin' in 1943. He even brushed against cinematic legend. Rumors swirl that he was originally considered for the role of Sam in Casablanca, before Dooley Wilson landed it. But in 1955, Muse got the last word, stepping into Sam's shoes for the TV adaptation. His impact wasn't just about breaking barriers, it was about proving that black artists belonged in every space Hollywood tried to keep them out of. Eddie Rochester Anderson. It's the late 1930s and radio waves crackle with laughter as a sharp, unmistakable voice cuts through the static. Eddie Rochester Anderson. His role as Rochester Van Jones on the Jack Benny program wasn't just a job, it was a revolution. Originally meant to be a one-off character, Anderson's razor-sharp wit and impeccable timing made him indispensable. By the 40s, he was one of the most recognizable voices in America, the first black male actor to hold a regular role on a nationwide radio show. But what made Rochester different? He wasn't just a servant, he was quick, sarcastic, and always ready with a comeback. In an era when black actors were often sidelined, Anderson's presence was impossible to ignore. His success wasn't just personal, it was a crack in Hollywood's rigid racial barriers. Anderson's influence stretched beyond entertainment. While details remain scarce, some accounts suggest he quietly supported black-owned businesses and civil rights efforts. And though Hollywood was slow to change, his legacy proved that black talent wasn't just present, it was powerful. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.